Hello everyone, it is great pleasure to be here and to share with you some reflections on the Indonesian welfare systems, especially how it has evolved within the broader global context of social policy transformations. My name is Tauchid Komara Yuda, a faculty member in the Department of Social Development and Welfare, Universitas Gadjah Mada, Indonesia. Okay, Indonesia in the global context. Now you can see here, let's take a look at the table ones, which show how Indonesia can be positioned within the existing global and Asian welfare regimes typologies. The upper part of the table refers to Esping Anderson's classic welfare state regimes, namely social democratic, conservative, and liberal models, which are mainly derived from the Western experience. This framework describes the Nordic, continental, Europeans, and Anglo-Saxon welfare systems. However, these categories are not fully adequate to explain non-Western contexts such as Indonesia. That's why the latter scholars like Ian Goff, Wood and Goff, and Ian Holiday expanded the typology to include the informal security regimes. These regimes capture countries where formal social protection is limited and informal networks such as family, community, and patron-client relations play a dominant roles. So within these frameworks, Southeast and East Asian countries are often described as the productivist welfare regimes, where social policy is subordinated to the economic policy and growth-oriented developmentalism is the main driver of social policy development. Now, if we position Indonesia within this landscape, it stands between the informal security regimes and the productivist model. In this context, Indonesia shares some characteristics with the Southeast Asian productivist states, such as the key prioritizations of the economic growth and the limited universal social rights. But at the same time, Indonesia still heavily relies on informal mechanisms, especially the family and community solidarity for welfare distributions. So we might call Indonesia as a hybrid informal productivist regimes. It means like not fully developmental universalized like Japan or Korea, nor developmental particularists like Singapore, but rather a middle path shaped by familisms, clientelisms, and partial state interventions. So this hybrid nature reflects Indonesia's ongoing transitions from informal security regimes toward a more institutionalized but still growth-oriented welfare states. Here, we can see a global map showing the social protection spending as the percentage of GDP based on the ILO data. So as you can notice from the slides, the darker blue regions, mostly in the Europes and some part of Latin America, represent the countries that spend around 15% or more of their GDP on the social protections. These are typically mature welfare states where social rights are institutionalized and coverage is nearly universal. By contrast, the lighter color countries, including most of Asia and also Africa, they allocate less than 5% of GDP to the social protections. So the spending reflects both limited fiscal capacity and also persistence of the informal welfare systems. Now, if we look specifically at Indonesia, it falls into the lowest category below 5% of GDP. This low level of spending tells us the two things. The first, welfare system is still underdeveloped compared to global standard. And secondly, social protection remains secondary to economic policy priorities. And this reinforces what we discussed earlier. Indonesia welfare development follow the productivist logics, where social programs are designed not primarily to redistribute the wealth or wealth redistributions, but to support economic growth and also political stability. So this map visually illustrates Indonesia positions in the global welfare landscape as the country with the emerging but limited welfare commitments, still relying on the informal mechanisms such as the family and the community network to fill the gaps. There are three defining features of Indonesian welfare regimes. First, it has the productivist orientations. This means that social policy is designed to support economic growth rather than to redistribute the wealth or reducing the inequality. In other words, welfare programs are often justified in terms of their contribution to the productivity, labor market participations, or human capital development. For example, policies in health and education are often seen as the investment in the workforce rather than as the universal social right. This approach is similar to the other East and Southeast Asian countries such as Malaysia, South Korea, Thailand, which prioritizes economic competitiveness over welfare expansions. Second, Indonesia maintains a familistic welfare systems. In this context, family plays a central role as the main provider of care and financial support, especially when the state or market fails to deliver. So this is quite visible in the healthcare spending, where the large proportion still comes from the household of packet payments. And in elderly care, which is mostly handled by family members, this reflects the enduring cultural norms of the mutual assistance. We call us Indonesia as the gotong royong. So in other words, we can call us the working together to achieve the common goals. So which is fills the gap left by the weak state protections. And the third, welfare access in Indonesia is often clientelistic. This means that access to the social benefits can depend on the political ties, patronage networks, patron-client networks, or local elite mediation, rather than on the universal citizenship rights. During the elections periods, for example, cash transfer programs are sometimes used as the political tools to secure the voter support. And as a result, welfare distribution is not always based on needs or entitlements, but on who you know or how politically strategic a group might be, right? Okay, next slide. And you can see here, these tables compare social protections expenditure among Southeast Asian countries. We can see that Indonesia's total spending is only 2.1% of GDP, which is below the regional average that's significantly lower than Malaysia and Thailand, both exceeding 4%. Most of Indonesian spending is concentrated in social insurance programs, while social assistance program, which directly targets to the poor, remains quite limited at 0.6%. There is also only a marginal budget for active labor market programs, indicating that the employment-related protection is still underdeveloped. This spending pattern illustrates the productivist orientation of Indonesian welfare regimes, means social policy is designed primarily to support economic participations rather than to ensure universal redistributions. Okay. Because of limited state capacity, you can see here, family play an extensive role in healthcare and other social protection areas. For example, family expenditure still dominates the total healthcare spending, showing that the family is the real social safety net for many Indonesians. Okay, here you can see also the pension coverage. You can see here, pension coverage remains very low, and only small share of workers contribute regularly. These situations push the older people to depend on their children, again reinforcing the familial nature of the welfare distributions in Indonesia. In this slide, you can also see the Asian financial crisis in 1990s was really a turning point for Indonesia. It was not just economic crisis, it changed almost everything about how the country was run. When the economy collapsed, it actually opened a window of opportunity for the big reforms. That's when Indonesia started to move toward democratizations, economic liberalizations, and eventually the birth of the modern social protections. And at the same time, unemployment doubled, price went crazy because of the high inflations, and the country faced serious political instability. All of this lead to the fall of Suharto authoritarian regimes, which has ruled for more than 3 decades. In response, the government launched what we call the Social Safety Nets Program, or in Indonesia we call as the Jaring Pengaman Sosial, GPS. This includes the rice subsidies for the poor, healthcare for free services, scholarships for the children for the low-income families, and block grants and microcredits for the small business, and public works programs known as the Padat Karya to create the temporary jobs. These programs started as the emergency measure, but over the times they become the foundations for Indonesian current welfare systems. Yeah, this is the starting point for how we think about the social protection today. So this slide shows how Indonesian social assistance system has evolved from Asian financial crisis up to the present day. You can see that every major period, especially around the general elections, tends to introduce new programs or policy adjustments. This reflects how social protections in Indonesia often grows through what we call as the policy layering. It means new programs being added on the top of the old ones, rather than replacing them with the new ones. Initially, after 1990 crisis, programs like subsidies, rice, health cards, and education scholarship were launched as the emergency response. But over time, this evolved into more structured initiatives like Raskin, BOS, Jamkesmas, and later into the current system, such as you can see like the Indonesian's education card and so on. Right? The main goal of these programs has always been poverty reductions, but the approach keeps changing. Yeah. For example, the Indonesian politicians often prefer unconditional cash transfer like bantuan langsung tunai because they are quick, visible, and politically popular, especially during the election years. We also see the introductions of conditional cash transfer, such as the program Keluarga Harapan, which is focused on the education and health care for low-income families. And another key feature is funding dependency. Yeah, many of these programs were initially supported by loans from the World Bank or foreign aid from the Australian governments, particularly through the TNP-2K, yeah, in the early 2000s and 10s. Altogether, the logic of the social assistance in Indonesia is shaped by crisis-driven origins, political incentive, and gradual institutional layering. It is not fully universal system yet, but it's been continuously adapting to balance poverty reductions, political realities, and economic priorities. Let's now take a look at the outcomes of Indonesian welfare development, especially in terms of poverty and inequality. And these figures, adapted from the Atkinson et al., shows the three key indicators over the times. As you can see in the green lines, an overall income inequality, and then in red you can see the poverty rates, and in purple this is reflects about illustrate about the top income share, which reflects the share of income held by the wealthiest groups. As we can see here, poverty, as you can see in the red lines, has declined sharply since 1970s, and especially after early millenniums. This shows that Indonesia poverty reduction programs have made a real difference, particularly through targeted social assistance like the cash transfer and education subsidies. However, if we look at the green lines, which represents the Gini index, inequality in this country has actually increased in recent decades. So, while more people have escaped from the poverty, the gap between rich and poor has widened. And if we look at the purple lines, which indicate the share of income controlled by the top 1%, it has also risen slightly, right? Showing that the economic gains are still concentrated at the top. So, from this graph, in short, we can assume that Indonesia has been successful in reducing the poverty, but less successful in addressing the inequality. This reflects a welfare system that is effective in providing minimum protections, but still limited in redistributing wealth or ensuring equal opportunities. Okay. Let's take a look at this figure, and it illustrates one of the key future challenges in Indonesian social protections. You can see here how to effectively cover the emerging or aspiring middle class group. So you can see here, this group sits between the poor and established middle class. They are moving up the economic ladder, gaining better access to education, healthcare, and opportunities. However, they remain highly vulnerable to the economic shocks that could easily push them back into the poverty. So if we look at the vertical axis here, it represents the population proportions. And at the bottom, we have those who are the poor. They are generally covered by social assistance programs such as the cash transfer or food subsidies. And at the top, we have the middle and upper classes who can afford social insurance or even private insurance. But right in the middle, this white area, often called the missing middle, is where the challenge lies. These are people who are not poor enough to qualify for the government social assistance, yet not rich enough to afford private or contributory social insurance schemes. This group includes many informal workers, small business owners, and urban families who are on the rise economically, but they still insecure. So, to conclude, the discussion reminds us that the social protection should not only focus on the poor, but also on those who are no longer poor yet not fully secure. This is what we call as the emerging middle class groups. They represent the Indonesian growing economic backbones, hardworking families, informal workers, and small entrepreneurs who drive national development but remain vulnerable to the sudden shocks. So this challenge for Indonesia's future social protection system is to make it more inclusive, adaptive, and also portable. ensuring the progress is sustained and no one falls back into the poverty. So thank you for the listenings, and I hope this sparks more reflections and collaborations on how we can build a truly inclusive social protection system for all Indonesians. Thank you.